It is the great embossing folder revival. I know I sound silly. That's okay. Okay, so embossing folders come in a bunch of different sizes, just about any pattern you can imagine. They're lots of fun and create a lot of texture in your background. They're basically folded pieces of plastic that have a pattern on the inside, and they create an impression and a depression for the most part. Every die cutting machine has different instructions on the platforms for how to do this. So how to build a single or double-sided embossing folder sandwich, 3D embossing folders. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's different ways for different sandwiches. For Sizzix Big Shot, you have your embossing folders and texture impression plates and all that good stuff in here. And it just depends on the machine, how you run it through. And usually the instructions now are pretty much on the platforms themselves. So you don't have to go and dig up any sandwiches or anything anymore. If you have an embossing folder like this one, a lot of the older embossing folders, I have a hard time running through my Platinum 6 now. I have to use a shim with it. I have to use a big thick shim with it. I don't have a embossing plate that goes in that because, well, embossing folders just weren't that popular, but they're coming back. So there's that. So they come in a couple different sizes, as you can see here. This is like 5x7. This is a City Road Map. This is an old Cuttlebug one. And then we have one that's by Darcy. And then we have the 3D ones. The 3D ones, as you can see, they're a lot thicker. They have a lot of dimension to them. They create tons of dimension on your paper, and they're stiff. These do require most of the time specialty plates and running through with specialty plates in your die cutting machine. Now, that's not the only way that you can emboss. And we are going to use all of these and make some different backgrounds and then create some quick cards. And I'll show you some really quick, cute techniques that you can do using your embossing folders. You can also use a embossing mat, piece of rubber, with a die, just a regular old die, and you follow the how to emboss a cut shape on whatever platform you're using. And most of the time it's the paper, it's the die with the flat side of it down, and then your paper, and then your embossing mat, and then your plate, and then you run it through. And that creates your pattern in your paper without actually cutting the paper. Now, sometimes with some heavier dies, it is going to cut your paper. But that's in some places, not all the way through. And it just depends on how much pressure your machine has. It depends on a lot of different things for this. So this method isn't going to give you, it isn't going to be as crisp of an embossed image as this is. This is going to give you and it, like I said, it depends on the machine. It depends on how tight it is when you run it through. It's going to depend on a lot of different things when you use a die to actually do an embossed image. It gives beautiful results. It's just going to be a varying thing depending on your machine. Now, Spellbinders actually makes dies that have embossed lines on them. So, for example, this pumpkin here has cut lines. That heavier line there is a cut line, but then these smaller lines are embossed lines. But I can actually take this and do the exact same thing of put this down, put my paper on top of it, and put my embossing mat on it, and put my plate on top of it, and run it through, and have an embossed pumpkin on it. And I will also get those little lines in it too. Now, with this, if I cut this out, I can run it back through and get those marks in it the same exact way. So it gives me a lot of different options. Spellbinders had that down many, 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 many years ago. Absolutely fantastic die cut and emboss with those. So we're going to do this a couple different ways, and I'm going to show you how to do all of those different things, and then how to use some different embossing folders here to add texture, and different ways to color those, and different ways to add color to them, and just add some texture to your cards. So let's get started. All right, so I went and grabbed a couple pieces of cardstock, and we're going to emboss some stuff, and we're going to also talk about some troubleshooting. So literally, to emboss, all you have to do is put your paper in here, fold it over, follow the instructions, and we are doing this right here. And so this is the platform, the embossing folder, and the standard cutting plate. Now, like I said, some of these older ones are a little bit thin, and I have to use a shim. So if I put this in here, I'm not going to have enough pressure to run this through. So I don't have any pressure there. There's no pressure there for me to create an impression in my paper. If you have this problem, you need a shim. Put your shim under your plate. And you're going to have a little bit tighter. And it's still... Do you want it to have any more texture than that? Now, there's a good question. Do you want it to have any more texture than that? Now, here's the good thing about embossing folders. Put it back in there. It'll snap back into place. So you can actually redo this if you want to, for it to have a little bit more of whatever you need it to be. This is the other option that you can do instead of a piece of paper, is a metal shim. Oops. Now I have a little bit more there as well. And I'm just showing you the different ways that you can add, that you're not going to hurt your machine, that you're not going to hurt your embossing folders, and it's going to give you a better result. Like I said, some of the older embossing folders, this machine just doesn't like them for some reason, and that's fine. So I just have to add some shims, and see, that has a lot more texture to it. Now remember that your paper is going to be broken now. It's broken down the fibers, so it's a little bit more flimsy. So we are going to use that in something. That's kind of cute. Now, what if you have a really piece of thick cardstock? This isn't it. But what if you have a really thick piece of cardstock? Really thick cardstock is going to break if you try to emboss it dry. What does that mean? You need to grab a sprayer and you need to mist it very, very lightly, and then wave it through the air a couple times. So we're going to mist it, wave it through the air a couple times, and it's damp. I mean, it's just very damp. See how it buckled the paper just slightly. Actually, let's use this road map one here because it's kind of cool. Oops, I'm sorry. I think I hit you. Well, I need another shim with that. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. My Sizzix Big Shot is better at embossing folders than my Platinum 6 is. There we go. Now I don't have any paper breakage. I have really crisp, clean image. I don't have any broken lines. I don't have any fibers sticking out. And a lot of times what happens when you have really thick cardstock is that you're going to have those broken lines and really poor image of the embossing folder. You can do this with you can spritz it with any cardstock that you want to make sure that you get a good image with your embossing folder. Okay, let's look at a 3D embossing folder. If I can pick up some paper here. This is a sweater. A sweater. And I'm going to make sure that I have the right plates, because unfortunately I have all clear plates. Notice I switched over to my Big Shot. My Big Shot does these so much easier. I just have to run them through and they work. I don't have the proper plates to do a 3D embossing folder with my Sizzix, with my Platinum 6. Look at that gorgeous texture. Isn't that beautiful? Now, if I do want a little bit more texture on this, because I can get a little bit more, I'm going to do this on another piece of paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mist this to make sure, because this is a bit heavier piece of cardstock. I'm going to mist this a little bit. I'm going to put this in my embossing folder, and I'm going to close this. And I'm going to close this flap on the plate. That's going to give me just a shade more tension, as well as a little bit thicker piece of cardstock. And I'm going to run this through, and you can actually feel it's a little bit more tension in it. So now I have a little bit more detail. This is two things going on here. This is, I sprayed this with water, so I'm going to get a little bit more detail in it, because the paper is going to be more accepting of the design. And I also added a little bit more pressure to it. So it's a two things going on here, but look at that detail in that embossing folder. So you can use this and make it look like it's just a regular embossing folder, but you can really get the detail out of it as well. So for a 3D embossing folder, I really do recommend that you always mist when you use these, so that you can get that maximum pop out of them. So now we're going to take a look at embossing with dies. Okay, so we are going to do our embossing with our regular old die here. So I'm using a Spellbinders Platinum 6, and this has an embossing plate. So it's a special plate. It's a little bit thicker than a standard cutting plate is. As you can see, it's a little bit thicker. And it's purple. And if you've stuck around with me anytime, you know purple's my favorite color. So this tells you how the sandwich works. So you put your die down, you put your paper down. Now if you have really thick paper for this, I do recommend that you mist it. And I'm actually going to go ahead and mist this anyway, just to help it prevent from tearing. All right, so we're going to do this, put this down. We're going to hold this down with our hand, put our mat on top of it. This is our embossing mat. Then we're going to put our plate on top of it. And now we're going to run it through our die cutting machine. big muscles. Okay. And now we have this beautiful background that doesn't have any torn spots in it because we misted it. Isn't that gorgeous? So that's with a die. You get these really crisp, clean edges in this. Ta-da. So you can use a die for dry embossing as well. Pumpkin, just because it's the easiest to see here. So we're going to die cut the pumpkin. So that means that we need our regular cutting plates because we're just going to die cut the pumpkin. So we have our regular cutting plates. Die cut the pumpkin. Okay. So we have die cut the pumpkin. I'm not going to take it out. I'm going to flip this over onto our base. I'm going to put the embossing mat on it. I'm going to put the embossing plate on top of it. Run this right back through. Pokey tool. And see, we have these beautiful little lines in here to decorate our pumpkin, along with the cut lines as well. But there's these beautiful little embossed lines. So that's how you dry emboss. And if you wanted to, you could actually dry emboss with the pumpkin all over here. Do the exact same thing. You can just flip this over, put it on paper, dry emboss with this. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Remember I said that you could use pretty much any background die? You can use stitched rectangle frames if you have them. And you can use the circle frames, you can use square frames, you can use whatever kind of frame you want to. And I have these stitched rectangle frames that I use all the time. Well, they make absolutely gorgeous frames, even if they're just embossed. You do need to use a little bit heavier paper and to do this. Just because they are dies, I do use a little bit heavier cardstock for this. Peel it away really carefully because this is taped on. Just make sure that you're not peeling it away and it's cutting through your paper when you're doing it. So I just peeled this away really, really gently to make sure it's not cutting through my paper. And then I have this gorgeous, gorgeous border around here. And now we're going to make a simple card. And I'm just going to play some music while I finish out this card. And then we'll come back and talk about what we're embossing, dry embossing on our next card. All right, let's use a 3D embossing folder next, and we're going to ink the paper after we emboss it. So I pulled out my Big Shot because I can do 3D embossing folders with this. I don't have the 3D embossing platform that I need for, or plate that I need for my Platinum 6. So I pulled out my Big Shot here, and it works just absolutely fantastic. And we're going to ink up the actual paper. The 3D embossing folder that I'm using is old paper, and it's from Stampin' Up. Look at that texture. So you can use either side of the paper. Either side. I'm going to use this side where it's raised. It kind of looks like stucco, honestly, if you look at it. It looks like stucco. My camera got a little bit out of focus there, so I'll just put my hand down so it would go back in focus. So I pulled out some Sahara Sand ink and a blending brush, and I'm really super lightly just going over all of the entire surface of the paper. And this is going to make all of those cracks and crevices in the paper, all of those raised areas really, really stand out. You can do this with a sponge blender, a domed blender. If you do this with a domed blender that has a handle on it where you've got to press down on it, just make sure that you're using really light pressure with a lot of ink in that blender. These blending brushes like this make this super easy, and they work really well to do this. I'm going to trim this panel down because I'm going to mount it in the middle of a card, and I'm also going to rough up these edges a little bit. I just trimmed 1/4 of an inch off of the top and the bottom. I'm going to add a little bit more ink to it, and then we're going to go ahead and rough up the edges on this. So this is one way that you can add a little bit of ink to your dry embossed images and papers. Do it after the fact. We're going to do it another way here in a few minutes at the end of our video. That's going to be our last card. Clean up a little bit. Now we're going to finish out our card, and I'm going to play a little bit of music while we do that. All right, we're going to use another 3D embossing folder, and I wanted to see something here as I was doing this. If you have thick cardstock and you want to prevent your cardstock from cracking, you can spritz it with water, and it will prevent it from cracking when you emboss it. And I did this to see if I was going to get a cleaner embossed image, because I had a little bit of almost cracking with this. Sorry, I'm a little bit off camera there, a little bit high. I had almost cracking, and I'm using Stampin' Up! Paper and cardstock, and it's pretty heavy duty. I mean, it's 80-pound cardstock, but I wanted to see if I was going to get a different result if I spritzed this cardstock, or if this was just one of those heavy duty 3D embossing folders that was going to give me that just a shade of texture there, if it was the embossing folder or if it was the paper. So I don't see any difference here at all in the image quality in changing it up and using the spritzed paper at all. So I don't have any difference there at all. So I went ahead and just used that. And I'm also letting the embossed folder, that embossed image, be the star of the show here. I'm using some older dies by Concord and Ninth, and I'm going to cut these out of some green cardstock, and I'm going to mount that on the embossed image. And that's going to be it. I'm going to let that embossing folder be the star of the show with the words sitting on top of it. And it's a super simple Christmas card too. So an embossing folder with all of that texture and just some words on top of it. Awesome card right there. We'll finish this up and you can watch the rest of this. So we're going to ink up our embossing folder this time. So I'm inking up the raised side of the embossing folder, and I'm just tapping the ink on here. The key to this is not to move your paper once it's inside of the folder. So you want to hold it really tight and run it through your die cutting machine. So I've done that, and so I have the ink is impressed down into the design of the paper. See, it's really pretty in person. It's hard to show on camera, absolutely gorgeous in person. So the next one we are going to do, and we're going to do it on the other side that has more flat surface on it. The results of this is going to vary a little bit because it's going to depend on how much pressure your die cutting machine has on the embossing folder. And I ran this through my Platinum 6, so it didn't have it didn't have as much pressure as if I had run it through my Sizzix Big Shot, and that's fine. It's really pretty. I can't wait for you to see this. This is cool. Check it out. Ta-da! You're going to get inky doing this one. It has this really unique look to it, and this is going to be something that's going to look different every time you do it, which is one reason I absolutely love that. So the areas in between that are raised through the ink, which is really cool. I had some leftover pieces from a card making kit and a scrapbook kit that all went together, so I just pulled those pieces together to make 2 cards for this. And I hope you really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for joining me on dry embossing using dies and embossing folders. And embossing folders have been around for a long time, and they're making a comeback. And the unique thing about them now is they're also making dies that go along with those embossing folders to step that up. And I have a video over on my Inked by Jill, which is Stampin' Up, that has one of those on there, and it is the seashells one, and I'll put a link to that over on my blog. And absolutely gorgeous stuff. So beautiful things that they're coming out with for 3D embossing folders now. So definitely check them out. It's not your 90s style embossing folders anymore. It's a whole lot of fancy stuff. So I hope you check them out, and thanks so much for joining me. Have an absolutely fantastic evening.